The Hour of the Dragon by Robert E. Howard. Part 3. Chapter 11. Swords of the South. Dawn that rose over the distant hills shone on the sails of a small craft that dropped down the river, which curves to within a mile of the walls of Tarantia and loops southward like a great shining serpent. This boat differed from the ordinary craft plying the broad Coratas, fishermen and merchant barges loaded with rich goods. It was long and slender, with a high curving prow, and was black as ebony, with white skulls painted along the gunwales. Amidships rose a small cabin, the windows closely masked. Other craft gave the ominously painted boat a wide berth, but it was obviously one of those pilgrim boats that carried a lifeless follower of Asura on his last mysterious pilgrimage southward to where, far beyond the Poitanian mountains, a river flowed at last into the blue ocean. In that cabin undoubtedly lay the corpse of the departed worshipper. All men were familiar with the sight of those gloomy craft, and the most fanatical votary of Mitra would not dare touch or interfere with their somber voyages. Where the ultimate destination lay, men did not know. Some said Stygia, some a nameless island lying beyond the horizon. Others said it was in the glamorous and mysterious land of Ventia, where the dead came home at last. But none knew certainly. They only knew that when a follower of Asura died, the corpse went southward down the great river in a black boat rowed by a giant slave, and neither boat nor corpse nor slave was ever seen again. Unless indeed certain dark tales were true, and it was always the same slave who rowed the boat southward. The man who propelled this particular boat was a huge and brown as the others, though closer scrutiny might have revealed the fact that the hue was the result of carefully applied pigments. He was clad in leather loincloth and sandals, and he handled the long sweep and oars with unusual skill and power. But none approached the grim boat closely, for it was well known that the followers of Asura were accursed, and that these pilgrim boats were loaded with dark magic. So men swung their boats wide and muttered an incantation as the dark craft slid past, and they never dreamed that they were thus assisting in the flight of their king and the Countess Albiona. It was a strange journey in that black slim craft down the great river for nearly 200 miles to where the Coratas swings eastward, skirting the Poitanian mountains. Like a dream, the ever-changing panorama glided past. During the day, Albiona lay patiently in the little cabin, as quietly as the corpse she pretended to be. Only late at night, after the pleasure boats with their fair occupants lounging on silken cushions in the flare of torches held by slaves had left the river, before dawn brought the hurrying fisher boats, did the girl venture out. Then she held a long sweep, cunningly bound in place by ropes to aid her, while Conan snatched a few hours of sleep. But the king needed little rest. The ardor of his desire drove him relentlessly, and his powerful frame was equal to the grinding test. Without halt or pause, they drove southward. So down the river they fled through nights when the flowing current mirrored the million stars, and through days of golden sunlight, leaving winter behind them as they sped southward. They passed cities in the night, above which throbbed and pulsed the reflection of the myriad lights, lordly river villas and fertile fruit groves. So at last the blue mountains of Poitain rose above them, tier above tier, like ramparts of the gods, and the great river, swerving from those turreted cliffs, swept thunderously through the marching hills with many a rapid and foaming cataract. Conan scanned the shoreline closely and finally swung the long sweep and headed inshore at a point where a neck of land jutted into the river, and fir trees grew in a curiously symmetrical ring about a grey, strangely shaped rock.
"Oh, these boats ride those falls we hear roaring ahead of us is more than I can see,"
he grunted.
"Others said they did, but there's where we halt. He said a man would be waiting for us with horses, but I don't see anyone. A word of our coming could have preceded us. I don't know anyway."
He drove inshore and bound apart an arching road in the low bank, and then, plunging into the water, washed the brown paint from his skin and emerged dripping and in his natural color. From the cabin he brought forth a suit of Aquilonian ring mail which Hadritus had procured for him, and his sword. These he donned while Albiona put on garments suitable for mountain travel. And when Conan was fully armed and turned to look toward the shore, he started and his hand went to his sword. For on the shore under the trees stood a black-cloaked figure holding the reins of a white palfrey and a bay war horse.
"Who are you?"
demanded the king. The other bowed low.
"A follower of Asura. A command came, I obeyed." "How came?"
inquired Conan, but the other merely bowed again.
"I have come to guide you through the mountains to the first Poitanian stronghold." "I don't need a guide," answered Conan. "I know these hills well. I thank you for the horses, but the Countess and I will attract less attention alone than if we were accompanied by an acolyte of Asura."
The man bowed profoundly and, giving the reins into Conan's hands, stepped into the boat. Casting off, he floated down the swift current toward the distant roar of the unseen rapids. With a baffled shake of his head, Conan lifted the Countess into the palfrey's saddle and then mounted the war horse and reined toward the summits that castellated the sky. The rolling country at the foot of the towering mountains was now a borderland, in a state of turmoil where the barons reverted to feudal practices, and bands of outlaws roamed unhindered. Poitain had not formally declared her separation from Aquilonia, but she was now, to all intents, a self-contained kingdom, ruled by her hereditary count Trocero. The rolling south country had submitted nominally to Valerius, but he had not attempted to force the passes guarded by strongholds where the crimson leopard banner of Poitain waved defiantly. The king and his fair companion rode up the long blue slopes in the soft evening. As they mounted higher, the rolling country spread out like a vast purple mantle far beneath them, shot with the shine of rivers and lakes, the yellow glint of broad fields, and the white gleam of distant towers. Ahead of them and far above, they glimpsed the first of the Poitanian holds, a strong fortress dominating a narrow pass, the crimson banner streaming against the clear blue sky. Before they reached it, a band of knights in burnished armor rode from among the trees, and their leader sternly ordered the travelers to halt. They were tall men with the dark eyes and raven locks of the south.
"Halt, sir, and state your business, and why you ride toward Poitain."
"Is Poitain in revolt then?"
asked Conan, watching the other closely.
"That a man in Aquilonian harness is halted and questioned like a foreigner?"
"Many rogues ride out of Aquilonia these days,"
answered the other coldly.
As for revolt, if you mean the repudiation of the usurper, then Poitain isn't revolt. We had rather serve the memory of a dead man than the scepter of a living dog.
Conan swept off his helmet and, shaking back his black mane, stared full at the speaker. The Poitainian started violently and went livid.
"Saints of heaven!" he gasped. "It is the king, alive!"
The others stared wildly. Then a roar of wonder and joy burst from them. They swarmed about Conan, shouting their war cries and brandishing their swords in their extreme emotion. The acclaim of Poitainian warriors was a thing to terrify the timid men.
"Oh, but Trossero will weep tears of joy to see you, sire!"
cried one.
"Ay, and Prospero!"
shouted another.
"The general has been like one wrapped in a mantle of melancholy, and curses himself night and day that he did not reach the Valkyria in time to die beside his king." "Now we will strike for Empery!"
yelled another, whirling his great sword about his head.
"Hail, Conan King of Poitain!"
The clangor of bright steel about him and the thunder of their acclaim frightened the birds that rose in gay-hued clouds from the surrounding trees. The hot southern blood was afire, and they desired nothing but for their new-found sovereign to lead them to battle and pillage.
"What is your command, sire?" they cried. "Let one of us ride ahead and bear the news of your coming into Poitain. Banners will weave from every tower, roses will carpet the road before your horse's feet, and all the beauty and chivalry of the south will give you the honor due you."
Conan shook his head.
"Who could doubt your loyalty? But winds blow over these mountains into the countries of my enemies, and I would rather these didn't know that I lived. Yet, take me to Trossero and keep my identity a secret."
So what the knights would have made a triumphal procession was more in the nature of a secret flight. They travelled in haste, speaking to no one except for a whisper to the captain on duty at each pass, and Conan rode among them with his visor lowered. The mountains were uninhabited save by outlaws and garrisons of soldiers who guarded the passes. The pleasure-loving Poitainians had no need, no desire to wrest a hard and scanty living from their stern breasts. South of the ranges, the rich and beautiful plains of Poitain stretched to the river Alimain, but beyond the river lay the land of Zingara. Even now, when winter was crisping the leaves beyond the mountains, the tall rich grass waved upon the plains where grazed the horses and cattle for which Poitain was famed. Palm trees and orange groves smiled in the sun, and the gorgeous purple and gold and crimson towers of castles and cities reflected the golden light. It was a land of warmth and plenty, of beautiful men and ferocious warriors. It is not only the hard lands that breed hard men. Poitain was surrounded by covetous neighbors, and her sons learned hardihood in incessant wars. To the north, the land was guarded by the mountains, but to the south, only the Alimain separated the plains of Poitain from the plains of Zingara, and not once but 1,000 times had that river run red. To the east lay Argos, and beyond that Ophir, proud kingdoms and avaricious. The knights of Poitain held their lands by the weight and edge of their swords, and little of ease and idleness they knew. So Conan came presently to the castle of Count Trossero. Conan sat on a silken divan in a rich chamber whose filmy curtains the warm breeze billowed. Trossero paced the floor like a panther, a lithe, restless man with the waist of a woman and the shoulders of a swordsman who carried his years lightly.
"Let us proclaim you King of Poitain,"
urged the Count.
"Let those northern pigs wear the yoke to which they have bent their necks. The south is still yours. Dwell here and rule us,
amid the flowers and the palms.
But Conan shook his head.
There is no noble land on earth than Poitain, but it cannot stand alone, bold as are its sons.
It did stand alone for generations,
retorted Trocero with the quick jealous pride of his breed.
We were not always a part of Aquilonia.
I know, but conditions are not as they were then, when all kingdoms were broken into principalities which warred with each other. The days of dukedoms and free cities are past. The days of empires are upon us. Rulers are dreaming imperial dreams, and only in unity is their strength.
Then let us unite Zingara with Poitain,
argued Trocero.
Half a dozen princes strive against each other, and the country is torn asunder by civil wars. We will conquer it, province by province, and add it to your dominions. Then, with the aid of the Zingarans, we will conquer Argos and Ophir. We will build an empire.
Again Conan shook his head.
Let others dream imperial dreams. I but wish to hold what is mine. I have no desire to rule an empire welded together by blood and fire. It's one thing to seize a throne with the aid of its subjects and rule them with their consent. It's another to subjugate a foreign realm and rule it by fear. I don't wish to be another Valerius. No, Trocero, I'll rule all Aquilonia and no more, or I'll rule nothing.
Then lead us over the mountains, and we will smite the Nemedians.
Conan's fierce eyes glowed with appreciation.
No, Trocero, it will be a vain sacrifice. I've told you what I must do to regain my kingdom. I must find the heart of Ahriman.
But this is madness,
protested Trocero.
The maunderings of a heretical priest, the mumblings of a mad witch woman.
You were not in my tent before Valkia,
answered Conan grimly, involuntarily glancing at his right wrist, on which blue marks still showed faintly.
You didn't see the cliffs thunder down to crush the flower of my army. No, Trocero, I've been convinced. Saltatoons, no mortal men, and only with the heart of Ahriman can I stand against him. So I'm riding to Cordova, alone.
But that is dangerous,
protested Trocero.
Life is dangerous,
rumbled the king.
I won't go as the king of Aquilonia, or even as a knight of Poitain, but as a wandering mercenary, as I rode in Zingara in the old days. Oh, I have enemies enough south of the Alimain, in the lands and the waters of the south. Many who won't know me as a king of Aquilonia will remember me as Conan of the Barajan pirates, or Amra of the Black Corsairs. But I have friends too, and men who'll aid me for their own private reasons.
A faint reminiscent grin touched his lips. Trocero dropped his hands helplessly and glanced at Albiona, who sat on a nearby divan.
I understand your doubts, my lord,
said she,
but I too saw the coin in the temple of Asura, and look you, Herodotus said it was dated 500 years before the fall of Acheron. If Zaltatun then is the man pictured on the coin as his majesty swears he is, that means he was no common wizard, even in his other life, for the years of his life were numbered by centuries, not as the lives of other men are numbered.
Before Trocero could reply, a respectful rap was heard on the door, and a voice called,
"My lord, we have caught a man skulking about the castle, who says he wishes to speak with your guest. I await your orders."
"A spy from Aquilonia,"
hissed Trocero, catching at his dagger, but Conan lifted his voice and called,
"Open the door and let me see him."
The door was opened, and a man was framed in it, grasped on either hand by stern-looking men-at-arms. He was a slender man, clad in a dark hooded robe. "Are you a follower of Asura?" asked Conan. The man nodded, and the stalwart men-at-arms looked shocked and glanced hesitantly at Trocero.
"The word came southward," said the man. "Beyond the Alamein we cannot aid you, for our sect goes no farther southward, but stretches eastward with the Korotas. But this I have learned, the thief who took the heart of Ahriman from Tarascus never reached Cordava. In the mountains of Poitain he was slain by robbers. The jewel fell into the hands of their chief, who, not knowing its true nature, and being harried after the destruction of his band by Poitanian knights, sold it to the Gothic merchant Zarathus."
"Ah!" Conan was on his feet, galvanized. "And what of Zarathus?"
4 days ago he crossed the Alamein, headed for Argos, with a small band of armed servants."
"He's a fool to cross Zingara in such times,"
said Trocero.
"Aye, times are troublous across the river, but Zarathus is a bold man, and reckless in his way. He is in great haste to reach Messantia, where he hopes to find a buyer for the jewel. Perhaps he hopes to sell it finally in Stygia. Perhaps he guesses at its true nature. At any rate, instead of following the long road that winds along the borders of Poitain, and so at last comes into Argos far from Messantia, he has struck straight across eastern Zingara, following the shorter and more direct route."
Conan smote the table with his clenched fist so that the great board quivered. "Then, by Crum, fortune has at last thrown the dice for me. A horse, Trocero, and the harness of a free companion. Zarathus has a long start, but not too long for me to overtake him if I follow him to the end of the world." Chapter 12. The Fang of the Dragon. At dawn, Conan waded his horse across the shallows of the Alamein and struck the wide caravan trail which ran southeastward, and behind him, on the farther bank, Trocero set his horse silently at the head of his steel-clad knights, with the crimson leopard of Poitain floating its long folds over him in the morning breeze. Silently they sat, those dark-haired men in shining steel, until the figure of their king had vanished in the blue of distance that whitened toward sunrise. Conan rode a great black stallion, the gift of Trocero. He no longer wore the armor of Aquilonia. His harness proclaimed him a veteran of the free companies, who were of all races. His headpiece was a plain morion, dented and battered. The leather and mail mesh of his hauberk were worn and shiny as if by many campaigns, and the scarlet cloak flowing carelessly from his mailed shoulders was tattered and stained. He looked the part of the hired fighting man, who had known all vicissitudes of fortune, plunder and wealth one day, an empty purse and a close-drawn belt the next. And more than looking the part, he felt the part, the awakening of old memories, the resurge of the wild, mad, glorious days of old, before his feet were set on the imperial path, when he was a wandering mercenary, roistering, brawling, guzzling, adventuring, with no thought for the morrow, and no desire save sparkling ale, red lips, and a keen sword to swing on all the battlefields of the world. Unconsciously he reverted to the old ways. A new swagger became evident in his bearing, in the way he set his horse. Half-forgotten oaths rose naturally to his lips, and as he rode, he hummed old songs that he had roared in chorus with his reckless companions in many a tavern and on many a dusty road or bloody field. It was an unquiet land through which he rode. The companies of cavalry which usually patrolled the river, alert for raids out of Poitain, were nowhere in evidence. Internal strife had left the borders unguarded. The long white road stretched bare from horizon to horizon. No laden camel trains or rumbling wagons or lowing herds were moved along it now. Only occasional groups of horsemen in leather and steel, hawk-faced, hard-eyed men who kept together and rode warily. These swept Conan with their searching gaze, but rode on, for the solitary rider's harness promised no plunder, but only hard strokes. Villages lay in ashes and deserted, the fields and meadows idle. Only the boldest would ride the roads these days, and the native population had been decimated in the civil wars and by raids from across the river. In more peaceful times, the road was thronged with merchants riding from Poitain to Messantia in Argos or back. But now these found it wiser to follow the road that led east through Poitain and then turn south down across Argos. It was longer, but safer. Only an extremely reckless man would risk his life and goods on this road through Zingara. The southern horizon was fringed with flame by night, and in the day straggling pillars of smoke drifted upward. In the cities and plains to the south, men were dying. Thrones were toppling and castles going up in flames. Conan felt the old tug of the professional fighting man to turn his horse and plunge into the fighting, the pillaging and the looting as in the days of old. Why should he toil to regain the rule of a people which had already forgotten him? Why chase a will of the wisp? Why pursue a crown that was lost forever? Why should he not seek forgetfulness, lose himself in the red tides of war and rapine that had engulfed him so often before? Could he not, indeed, carve out another kingdom for himself? The world was entering an age of iron, an age of war and imperialistic ambition. Some strong man might well rise above the ruins of nations as a supreme conqueror. Why should it not be himself? So his familiar devil whispered in his ear, and the phantoms of his lawless and bloody past crowded upon him. But he did not turn aside. He rode onward, following a quest that grew dimmer and dimmer as he advanced, until sometimes it seemed that he pursued a dream that never was. He pushed the black stallion as hard as he dared, but a long white road lay before him from horizon to horizon. It was a long start Zoratha's head, but Conan rode steadily on, knowing that he was traveling faster than the burdened merchants could travel. And so he came to the castle of Count Valbrosso, perched like a vulture's eyrie on a bare hill overlooking the road. Valbrosso rode down with his men-at-arms, a lean dark man with glittering eyes and a predatory beak of a nose. He wore black plate armor and was followed by 30 spearmen, black-mustached hawks of the border wars, as avaricious and ruthless as himself. Of late, the toll of the caravans had been slim, and Valbrosso cursed the civil wars that stripped the roads of their fat traffic, even while he blessed them for the free hand they allowed him with his neighbors. He had not hoped much from the solitary rider he had glimpsed from his tower, but all was grist that came to his mill. With a practiced eye he took in Conan's worn mail and dark scarred face, and his conclusions were the same as those of the riders who had passed the Cimmerian on the road. an empty purse, and a ready blade.
"Who are you, knave?"
he demanded.
"A mercenary, riding for Argos,"
answered Conan.
"What matter names?"
"You are riding in the wrong direction for a free companion," grunted Valbroso. "Southward the fighting is good, and also the plundering. Join my company. You won't go hungry. The road remains bare of fat merchants to strip, but I mean to take my rogues and fare southward to sell our swords to whichever side seems strongest."
Conan did not at once reply, knowing that if he refused outright, he might be instantly attacked by Valbrosos's men-at-arms. Before he could make up his mind, the Zincaran spoke again.
"You rogues of the free companies always know tricks to make men talk. I have a prisoner, the last merchant I caught by Mitra, and the only one I've seen for a week, and the knave is stubborn. He has an iron box, the secret of which defies us, and I've been unable to persuade him to open it. By Ishtar, I thought I knew all the modes of persuasion there are, but perhaps you, as a veteran free companion, know some that I do not. At any rate, come with me and see what you may do."
Valbrosos's words instantly decided Conan. That sounded a great deal like Zarathus. Conan did not know the merchant, but any man was stubborn enough to try to traverse the Zingaran road in times like these would very probably be stubborn enough to defy torture. He fell in beside Valbroso and rode up the straggling road to the top of the hill where the gaunt castle stood. As a man-at-arms, he should have ridden behind the count, but force of habit made him careless, and Valbroso paid no heed. Years of life on the border had taught the count that the frontier is not a royal court. He was aware of the independence of the mercenaries, behind whose swords many a king had trodden the throne path. There was a dry moat, half filled with debris in some places. They clattered across the drawbridge and through the arch of the gate. Behind them the portcullis fell with a sullen clang. They came into a bare courtyard, grown with straggling grass and with a well in the middle. Shacks for the men-at-arms straggled about the bailey wall, and women, slatternly or decked in gaudy finery, looked from the doors. Fighting men in rusty mail tossed dice on the flags under the arches. It was more like a bandit's hold than the castle of a nobleman. Valbroso dismounted and motioned Conan to follow him. They went through a doorway and along a vaulted corridor, where they were met by a scarred, hard-looking man in mail descending a stone staircase, evidently the captain of the guard.
"How, Beloso?" quoth Valbroso. "Has he spoken?"
"He's stubborn," muttered Beloso, shooting a glance of suspicion at Conan. Valbroso ripped out an oath and stamped furiously up the winding stair, followed by Conan and the captain. As they mounted, the groans of a man in mortal agony became audible. Valbrosos's torture room was high above the court, instead of in a dungeon below. In that chamber, where a gaunt, hairy beast of a man in leather breeks squatted gnawing a beef bone voraciously, stood the machines of torture racks, boots, hooks, and all the implements that the human mind devises to tear flesh, break bones, and rend and rupture veins and ligaments. On a rack, a man was stretched naked, and a glance told Conan that he was dying. The unnatural elongation of his limbs and body told of unhinged joints and unnameable ruptures. He was a dark man with an intelligent aquiline face and quick dark eyes. They were glazed and bloodshot now with pain, and the dew of agony glistened on his face. His lips were drawn back from blackened gums.
"There is the box!"
Viciously, Valbroso kicked a small but heavy iron chest that stood on the floor nearby. It was intricately carved, with tiny skulls and writhing dragons curiously intertwined, but Conan saw no catch or hasp that might serve to unlock the lid. The marks of fire of axe and sledge and chisel showed on it but as scratches.
"This is the dog's treasure box,"
said Valbroso angrily.
"All men of the south know of Zarathus and his iron chest. Mitra knows what is in it, but he will not give up its secret."
Zarathus. It was true then, the man he sought lay before him. Conan's heart beat suffocatingly as he leaned over the writhing form, though he exhibited no evidence of his painful eagerness. "Ease those ropes, knave!" he ordered the torturer harshly, and Valbroso and his captain stared. In the forgetfulness of the moment, Conan had used his imperial tone, and the brute in leather instinctively obeyed the knife edge of command in that voice. He eased away gradually, for else the slackening of the ropes had been as great a torment to the torn joint as further stretching. Catching up a vessel of wine that stood nearby, Conan placed the rim to the wretch's lips. Zarathus gulped spasmodically, the liquid slopping over on his heaving breast. Into the bloodshot eyes came a gleam of recognition, and the froth-smeared lips parted. From them issued a racking whimper in the Gothic tongue.
"Is it death then? Is it the long agony ended? For this is King Conan, who died at Valkia, and I am among the dead."
"You're not dead," said Conan, "but you're dying. You'll be tortured no more, I'll see to that, but I can't help you further. Yet, before you die, tell me how to open your iron box."
"My iron box,"
mumbled Zarathus in delirious, disjointed phrases.
"The chest forged in unholy fires among the flaming mountains of Crusher. The metal no chisel can cut. How many treasures has it borne across the width and the breadth of the world, but no such treasure as it now holds."
"Tell me how to open it," urged Conan. "It can do you no good, and it may aid me."
You are Conan,"
muttered the Gothian.
"I have seen you sitting on your throne in the great public hall of Tarantia, with your crown on your head and a scepter in your hand. But you are dead. You died at Valkia, and so I know my own end is at hand." "What does the dog say?"
demanded Valbroso impatiently, not understanding Gothic.
"Will he tell us how to open the box?"
As if the voice roused a spark of life in the twisted breast, Zarathus rolled his bloodshot eyes towards the speaker.
"Only Valbroso will I tell,"
he gasped in Zigaran.
"Death is upon me. Lean close to me, Valbroso."
The Count did so, his dark face lit with avarice. Behind him, his saturnine Captain Belloso crowded closer.
"Press the 7 skulls on the rim, one after another,"
gasped Zarathus.
"Press then the head of the dragon that rides across the lid. Then press the sphere in the dragon's claws. That will release the secret catch. Quick, the box!"
cried Valbroso with an oath. Conan lifted it and set it on a dais, and Valbroso shouldered him aside. "Let me open it," cried Belloso, starting forward. Valbroso cursed him back, his greed blazing in his black eyes.
"None but me shall open it,"
he cried. Conan, whose hand had instinctively gone to his hilt, glanced at Zarathus. The man's eyes were glazed and bloodshot, but they were fixed on Valbroso with burning intensity. And was there the shadow of a grim, twisted smile on the dying man's lips? Not until the merchant knew he was dying had he given up the secret. Conan turned to watch Valbroso, even as the dying man watched him. Along the rim of the lid, 7 skulls were carved among intertwining branches of strange trees. An inlaid dragon writhed its way across the top of the lid, amid ornate arabesques. Valbroso pressed the skull in fumbling haste, and as he jammed his thumb down on the carved head of the dragon, he swore sharply and snatched his hand away, shaking it in irritation.
"A sharp point on the carvings," he snarled. "I've prickled my thumb."
He pressed the gold bowl clutched in the dragon's talons, and the lid flew abruptly open. Their eyes were dazzled by a golden flame. It seemed to their dazed minds that the carven box was full of glowing fire that spilled over the rim and dripped through the air in quivering flakes. Belloso cried out, and Valbroso sucked in his breath. Conan stood speechless, his brain snared by the blaze.
"Mitra, what a jewel!"
Valbroso's hand dived into the chest, came out with a great pulsing crimson sphere that filled the room with a lambent glow. In its glare, Valbroso looked like a corpse, and the dying man on the loosened wreck laughed wildly and suddenly.
"Fool!" he screamed. "The jewel is yours. I give you death with it. The scratch on your thumb. Look at the dragon's head, Valbroso."
They all wheeled, stared. Something tiny and dully gleaming stood up from the gaping carved mouth.
"The dragon's Fang!"
shrieked Zarathus.
"Steeped in the venom of the black Stygian scorpion. Fool, fool to open the box of Zarathus with your naked hand. Death, you're a dead man now."
And with bloody foam on his lips, he died. Valbroso staggered, crying out.
"Ah, Mitra, I burn!"
he shrieked.
"My veins race with liquid fire. My joints are bursting asunder. Death, death!"
And he reeled and crashed headlong. There was an instant of awful convulsions in which the limbs were twisted into hideous and unnatural positions. And then, in that posture, the man froze, his glassy eyes staring sightlessly upward, his lips drawn back from blackened gums.
"Dead,"
muttered Conan, stooping to pick up the jewel where it rolled on the floor from Valbroso's rigid hand. It lay on the floor like a quivering pool of sunset fire.
"Dead,"
muttered Belloso with madness in his eyes, and then he moved. Conan was caught off guard, his eyes dazzled, his brain dazed by the blaze of the great gem. He did not realize Belloso's intention until something crashed with terrible force upon his helmet. The glow of the jewel was splashed with redder flame, and he went to his knees under the blow. He heard a rush of feet, a bellow of ox-like agony. He was stunned but not wholly senseless, and realized that Belloso had caught up the iron box and crushed it down on his head as he stooped. Only his bassinet had saved his skull. He staggered up, drawing his sword, trying to shake the dimness out of his eyes. The room swam to his dizzy gaze. But the door was open, and fleet footsteps were dwindling down at the winding stair. On the floor, the brutish torturer was gasping out his life with a great gash under his breast, and the heart of Ahriman was gone. Conan reeled out of the chamber, sword in hand, blood streaming down his face from under his burgonet. He ran drunkenly down the steps, hearing a clang of steel in the courtyard below, shouts, then the frantic drum of hoofs. Rushing into the bailey, he saw the men-at-arms milling about confusedly, while women screeched. The postern gate stood open, and a soldier lay across his pike with his head split. Horses, still bridled and saddled, ran neighing about the court, Conan's black stallion among them.
"He's mad!"
howled a woman, wringing her hands as she rushed brainlessly about.
"He came out of the castle like a mad dog, hewing right and left. Pelosos is mad. Where's Lord Malbroso?"
"Which way did he go?" roared Conan. All turned and stared at the stranger's blood-stained face and naked sword.
"Through the postern!"
shrilled a woman, pointing eastward, and another bawled,
"Who is this rogue?"
"Peloso has killed Malbroso!" yelled Conan, leaping and seizing the stallion's mane as the men-at-arms advanced uncertainly on him. A wild outcry burst forth at his news, but their reaction was exactly as he had anticipated. Instead of closing the gates to take him prisoner or pursuing the fleeing slayer to avenge their lord, they were thrown into even greater confusion by his words. Wolves bound together only by fear of Malbroso, they owed no allegiance to the castle or to each other. Swords began to clash in the courtyard, and women screamed. And in the midst of it all, none noticed Conan as he shot through the postern gate and thundered down the hill. The wide plain spread before him, and beyond the hill the caravan road divided. One branch ran south, the other east. And on the eastern road he saw another rider, bending low and spurring hard. The plain swam to Conan's gaze. The sunlight was a thick red haze, and he reeled in his saddle, grasping the flowing mane with his hand. Blood rained on his mail, but grimly he urged the stallion on. Behind him, smoke began to pour out of the castle on the hill, where the count's body lay forgotten and unheeded beside that of his prisoner. The sun was setting. Against the lurid red sky the two black figures fled. The stallion was not fresh, but neither was the horse ridden by Peloso. But the great beast responded mightily, calling on deep reservoirs of reserve vitality. Why the Zingaran fled from one pursuer, Conan did not tax his bruised brain to guess. Perhaps unreasoning panic rode Peloso, born of the madness that lurked in that blazing jewel. The sun was gone. The white road was a dim glimmer through a ghostly twilight, fading into purple gloom far ahead of him. The stallion panted, laboring hard. The country was changing in the gathering dusk. Bare plains gave way to clumps of oaks and elders. Low hills mounted up in the distance. Stars began to blink out. The stallion gasped and reeled in his course. But ahead rose a dense wood that stretched to the hills on the horizon, and between it and himself Conan glimpsed the dim form of the fugitive. He urged on the distressed stallion, for he saw that he was overtaking his prey yard by yard. Above the pound of the hoofs, a strange cry rose from the shadows, but neither pursuer nor pursued gave heed. As they swept in under the branches that overhung the road, they were almost side by side. A fierce cry rose from Conan's lips as his sword went up. A pale oval of a face was turned toward him, a sword gleamed in a half-seen hand, and Peloso echoed the cry. And then the weary stallion, with a lurch and a groan, missed his footing in the shadows and went heels over head, hurling his dazed rider from the saddle. Conan's throbbing head crashed against the stone, and the stars were blotted out in a thicker night. How long Conan lay senseless he never knew. His first sensation of returning consciousness was that of being dragged by one arm over rough and stony ground and through dense underbrush. Then he was thrown carelessly down, and perhaps the jolt brought back his senses. His helmet was gone, his head ached abominably, he felt a qualm of nausea, and blood was clotted thickly among his black locks. But with the vitality of a wild thing, life and consciousness surged back into him, and he became aware of his surroundings. A broad red moon was shining through the trees, by which he knew that it was long after midnight. He had lain senseless for hours, long enough to have recovered from that terrible blow Beloso had dealt him, as well as the fall which had rendered him senseless. His brain felt clearer than it had felt during the mad ride after the fugitive. He was not lying beside the white road, he noticed with a start of surprise, as his surroundings began to record themselves on his perceptions. The road was nowhere in sight. He lay on the grassy earth in a small glade hemmed in by a black wall of tree stems and tangled branches. His face and hands were scratched and lacerated as if he had been dragged through brambles. Shifting his body, he looked about him. And then he started violently. Something was squatting over him. At first, Conan doubted his consciousness, though it was but a figment of delirium. Surely it could not be real, that strange, motionless grey being that squatted on its haunches and stared down at him with unblinking, soulless eyes. Conan lay and stared, half expecting it to vanish like a figure of a dream, and then a chill of recollection crept along his spine. Half-forgotten memories surged back, of grisly tales whispered of the shapes that haunted these uninhabited forests at the foot of the hills that marked the Zingaran-Argosian border. Ghouls, men called them, eaters of human flesh, spawn of darkness, children of unholy matings of a lost and forgotten race with the demons of the underworld. Somewhere in these primitive forests were the ruins of an ancient accursed city, men whispered, and among its tombs slunk grey, anthropomorphic shadows. Conan shuddered strongly. He lay staring at the malformed head that rose dimly above him, and cautiously he extended a hand towards the sword at his hip. With a horrible cry that the man involuntarily echoed, the monster was at his throat. Conan threw up his right arm, and the dog-like jaws closed on it, driving the mail links into the hard flesh. The misshapen yet man-like hands clutched for his throat, but he evaded them with a heave and roll of his whole body, at the same time drawing his dagger with his left hand. They tumbled over and over on the grass, smiting and tearing. The muscles coiling under that grey corpse-like skin were stringy and hard as steel wires, exceeding the strength of a man. But Conan's thews were iron too, and his mail saved him from the gnashing fangs and ripping claws long enough for him to drive home his dagger again and again and again. The horrible vitality of the semi-human monstrosity seemed inexhaustible, and the king's skin crawled at the feel of that slick, clammy flesh. He put all his loathing and savage revulsion behind the plunging blade, and suddenly the monster heaved up convulsively beneath him as the point found its grisly heart, and then lay still. Conan rose, shaken with nausea. He stood in the center of the glade uncertainly, sword in one hand and dagger in the other. He had not lost his instinctive sense of direction as far as the points of the compass were concerned, but he did not know in which direction the road lay. He had no way of knowing in which direction the ghoul had dragged him. Conan glared at the silent, black, moon-dappled woods which ringed him, and felt cold moisture beat his flesh. He was without a horse and lost in these haunted woods, and that staring, deformed thing at his feet was a mute evidence of the horrors that lurked in the forest. He stood almost holding his breath in his painful intensity, straining his ears for some crack of twig or rustle of grass. When a sound did come, he started violently. Suddenly out of the night air broke the scream of a terrified horse. His stallion! There were panthers in the wood, or ghouls ate beasts as well as men. He broke savagely through the brush in the direction of the sound, whistling shrilly as he ran, his fear drowned in berserk rage. If his horse was killed, there went his last chance of following Baloso and recovering the jewel. Again the stallion screamed with fear and fury somewhere nearer. There was a sound of lashing heels and something that was struck heavily and gave way. Conan burst out into the wide white road without warning, and saw the stallion plunging and rearing in the moonlight, his ears laid back, his eyes and teeth flashing wickedly. He lashed out with his heels at the slinking shadow that ducked and bobbed about him, and then about Conan other shadows moved, grey furtive shadows that closed in on all sides. A hideous charnel house scent reeked up in the night air. With a curse, the king hewed right and left with his broadsword, thrust and ripped with his dagger. Dripping fangs flashed in the moonlight, foul paws caught at him, but he hacked his way through to the stallion, caught the rein, leaped into the saddle. His sword rose and fell, a frosty arc in the moon, showering blood as it split misshapen heads, clove shambling bodies. The stallion reared, biting and kicking. They burst through and thundered down the road. On either hand, for a short space, flitted grey, abhorrent shadows. Then these fell behind, and Conan, topping a wooded crest, saw a vast expanse of bare slopes sweeping up and away before him. Chapter 13. A Ghost Out of the Past. Soon after sunrise, Conan crossed the Argosian border. Of Baloso he had seen no trace. Either the captain had made good his escape while the king lay senseless, or had fallen prey to the grim man-eaters of the Zingaron forest. But Conan had seen no signs to indicate the latter possibility. The fact that he had lain unmolested for so long seemed to indicate that the monsters had been engrossed in futile pursuit of the captain. And if the man lived, Conan felt certain that he was riding along the road somewhere ahead of him. Unless he had intended going into Argos, he would never have taken the eastward road in the first place. The helmeted guards at the frontier did not question the Cimmerian. A single wandering mercenary required no passport nor safe conduct, especially when his unadorned mail showed him to be in the service of no lord. Through the low grassy hills, where streams murmured and oak groves dappled the sward with lights and shadows, he rode, following the long road that rose and fell away ahead of him over dales and rises in the blue distance. It was an old road, this highway from Poitain to the sea. Argos was at peace. Laden ox wains rumbled along the road, and men with bare, brown, brawny arms toiled in orchards and fields that smiled away under the branches of the roadside trees. Old men on settles before inns under spreading oak branches called greetings to the wayfarer. From the men that worked the fields, from the garrulous old men in the inns, where he slaked his thirst with great leathern jacks of foaming ale, from the sharp-eyed, silk-clad merchants he met upon the road, Conan sought for news of Beloso. Stories were conflicting, but this much Conan learned, that a lean, wiry Zingaran with the dangerous black eyes and mustaches of the western folk was somewhere on the road ahead of him, and apparently making for Messantia. It was a logical destination. All the seaports of Argos were cosmopolitan, in strong contrast with the inland provinces, and Messantia was the most polyglot of all. Craft of all the maritime nations rode in its harbour, and refugees and fugitives from many lands gathered there. Laws were lax, for Messantia thrived on the trade of the sea, and her citizens found it profitable to be somewhat blind in their dealings with seamen. It was not only legitimate trade that flowed into Messantia. Smugglers and buccaneers played their part. All this Conan knew well, for had he not, in the days of old when he was a Barachan pirate, sailed by night into the harbour of Messantia to discharge strange cargoes? Most of the pirates of the Barachan Isles, small islands on the southwestern coast of Zingara, were Argosian sailors, and as long as they confined their attentions to the shipping of other nations, the authorities of Argos were not too strict in their interpretation of sea laws. But Conan had not limited his activities to those of the Barachans. He had also sailed with the Zingaran buccaneers, and even with those wild black corsairs that swept up from the far south to harry the northern coasts, and this put him beyond the pale of any law. If he were recognized in any of the ports of Argos, it would cost him his head. But without hesitation he rode on to Messantia, halting day and night only to rest the stallion and to snatch a few winks of sleep for himself. He entered the city unquestioned, merging himself with the throngs that poured continually in and out of this great commercial center. No walls surrounded Messantia. The sea and the ships of the sea guarded the great southern trading city. It was evening when Conan rode leisurely through the streets that marched down to the waterfront. At the end of these streets he saw the wharves and the masts and sails of ships. He smelled salt water for the first time in years, heard the thrum of cordage and the creak of spars in the breeze that was kicking up whitecaps out beyond the headlands. Again the urge of far wandering tugged at his heart. But he did not go on to the wharves. He reined aside and rode up a steep flight of wide, worn stone steps to a broad street where ornate white mansions overlooked the waterfront and the harbour below. Here dwelt the men who had grown rich from the hard-won fat of the seas, a few old sea captains who had found treasure afar, many traders and merchants who never trod the naked decks nor knew the roar of tempest of sea fight. Conan turned in his horse at a certain gold-worked gate, and rode into a court where a fountain tinkled and pigeons fluttered from marble coping to marble flagging. A page in jagged silken japon and hose came forward inquirely. The merchants of Messantia dealt with many strange and rough characters, but most of these smacked of the sea. It was strange that a mercenary trooper should so freely ride into the court of a lord of commerce.
"The merchant Publio dwells here."
It was more statement than question, and something in the timbre of the voice caused the page to doff his feathered chaperone as he bowed and replied,
"Aye, so he does, my captain."
Conan dismounted, and the page called a servitor, who came running to receive the stallion's rein.
"Your master is within."
Conan drew off his gauntlets and slapped the dust of the road from cloak and mail.
"Oi, my captain, whom shall I announce?"
"I'll announce myself,"
grunted Conan,
"I know the way well enough. Bide you here."
and obeying that peremptory command, the page stood still, staring after Conan as the latter climbed a short flight of marble steps, and wondering what connection his master might have with this giant fighting man who had the aspect of a northern barbarian. Menials at their tasks halted and gaped open-mouthed as Conan crossed a wide, cool balcony overlooking the court and entered a broad corridor through which the sea breeze swept. Halfway down this he heard a quill scratching and turned into a broad room whose many wide casements overlooked the harbour. Publio sat at a carved teakwood desk, writing on rich parchment with a golden quill. He was a short man with a massive head and quick dark eyes. His blue robe was of the finest watered silk, trimmed with cloth of gold, and from his thick white throat hung a heavy golden chain. As the Cimmerian entered, the merchant looked up with a gesture of annoyance. He froze in the midst of his gesture. His mouth opened. He stared as at a ghost out of the past. Unbelief and fear glimmered in his wide eyes.
"Well,"
said Conan,
"have you no word of greeting, Publio?"
Publio moistened his lips.
"Conan,"
he whispered incredulously.
"Mitra, Conan, Amra." "Who else?"
The Cimmerian unclasped his cloak and threw it with the gauntlets down upon the desk.
"How, man!"
he exclaimed irritably.
"Can't you at least offer me a beaker of wine? My throat's caked with the dust of the highway."
"Aye, wine!" echoed Publio mechanically. Instinctively his hand reached for a gong, then recoiled as from a hot coal, and he shuddered. While Conan watched him with a flicker of grim amusement in his eyes, the merchant rose and hurriedly shut the door, first craning his neck up and down the corridor to be sure that no slave was loitering about. Then, returning, he took a gold vessel of wine from a nearby table, and was about to fill a slender goblet when Conan impatiently took the vessel from him, and lifting it with both hands, drank deep and with gusto.
"Aye, it's Conan right enough," muttered Publio. "Man, are you mad?"
"By crum, Publio,"
said Conan, lowering the vessel but retaining it in his hands.
"You dwell in different quarters than of old. It takes an Argosian merchant to wring wealth out of a little waterfront shop that stank of rotten fish and cheap wine."
"The old days are past,"
muttered Publio, drawing his robe about him with a slight involuntary shudder.
"I have put off the past like a worn-out cloak."
"Well,"
retorted Conan,
"you can't put me off like an old cloak. It isn't much I want of you, but that much I do want. And you can't refuse me. We had too many dealings in the old days. Am I such a fool that I'm not aware that this fine mansion was built on my sweat and blood? How many cargoes from my galleys pass through your shop?"
All merchants of Messantia have dealt with the sea rovers at one time or another, mumbled Publio nervously.
But not with the black corsairs, answered Conan grimly.
For Mitra's sake, be silent, ejaculated Publio, sweat starting out of his brow. His fingers jerked at the gilt-worked edge of his robe.
Well, I only wished to recall it to your mind, answered Conan. Do not be so fearful. You took plenty of risks in the past when you were struggling for life and wealth in that lousy little shop down by the wharves, and were hand and glove with every buccaneer and smuggler and pirate from here to the Barachan Isles. Prosperity must have softened you.
I am respectable, began Publio.
Meaning you're rich as hell,
snorted Conan.
Why did you grow wealthy so much quicker than your competitors? Was it because you did a big business in ivory and ostrich feathers, copper and skins and pearls and hammer gold ornaments and other things from the coast of Kush? And where did you get them so cheaply, while other merchants were paying their weight in silver to the Stygians for them? I'll tell you, in case you've forgotten, you bought them from me at considerably less than their value, and I took them from the tribes of the Black Coast, and from the ships of the Stygians, aye, and the Black Corsairs.
In Mitra's name, cease, begged Publio. I have not forgotten. But what are you doing here? I am the only man in Argos who knew that the king of Aquilonia was once Conan the Buccaneer in the old days. But word has come southward of the overthrow of Aquilonia and the death of the king.
My enemies have killed me 100 times by rumors, grunted Conan. Yet here I sit and guzzle wine of Kyros.
And he suited the action to the word. Lowering the vessel, which was now nearly empty, he said,
It's but a small thing I ask of you, Publio. I know that you're aware of everything that goes on in Messantia. I want to know if a Zingaran named Beloso, or he might call himself anything, is in this city. He's tall and lean and dark like all his race, and it's likely he'll seek to sell a very rare jewel.
Publio shook his head. I have not heard of such a man, but thousands come and go in Messantia. If he is here, my agents will discover him.
Good. Send them to look for him. And in the meantime, have my horse cared for, and food served me here in this room.
Publio assented volubly, and Conan emptied the wine vessel, tossed it carelessly into a corner, and strode to a nearby casement, involuntarily expanding his chest as he breathed deep of the salt air. He was looking down upon the meandering waterfront streets. He swept the ships in the harbor with an appreciative glance, then lifted his head and stared beyond the bay, far into the blue haze of the distance where sea met sky. And his memory sped beyond that horizon to the golden seas of the south under flaming suns, where laws were not and life ran hotly. Some vagrant scent of spice or palm woke clear-etched images of strange coasts where mangroves grew and drums thundered, of ships locked in battle and decks running blood, of smoke and flame and the crying of slaughter. Lost in his thoughts, he scarcely noticed when Publius stole from the chamber. Gathering up his robe, the merchant hurried along the corridors until he came to a certain chamber where a tall, gaunt man with a scar upon his temple wrote continually upon parchment. There was something about this man which made his clerkly occupation seem incongruous. To him Publio spoke abruptly. "Conan has returned!" "Conan?" The gaunt man started up, and the quill fell from his fingers. "The Corsair?" "Aye." The gaunt man went livid. "Is he mad? If he is discovered here, we are ruined. They will hang a man who shelters or trades with a Corsair as quickly as they'll hang the Corsair himself. What if the governor should learn of our past connections with him?" "He will not return," answered Publio grimly. "Send your men into the markets and wharf side dives and learn if one Beloso, a Zingaran, is in Messantia. Conan said he had a gem which he will probably seek to dispose of. The jewel merchants should know of him, if any do. And here is another task for you. Pick up a dozen or so desperate villains who can be trusted to do away with a man and hold their tongues afterward. You understand me?" "I understand." The other nodded slowly and somberly. "I have not stolen, cheated, lied, and fought my way up from the gutter to be undone now by a ghost out of my past," muttered Publio, and the sinister darkness of his countenance at that moment would have surprised the wealthy nobles and ladies who bought their silks and pearls from his many stalls. But when he returned to Conan a short time later, bearing in his own hand a platter of fruit and meats, he presented a placid face to his unwelcome guest. Conan still stood at the casement, staring down into the harbour at the purple and crimson and vermilion and scarlet sails of galleons and carracks and galleys and dromonds. "There's a Stygian galley, if I'm not blind," he remarked, pointing to a long, low, slim black ship lying apart from the others, anchored off the low, broad, sandy beach that curved round to the distant headland. "Is there peace, then, between Stygia and Argos?" "The same sort that has existed before," answered Publio, setting the platter on the table with a sigh of relief, for it was heavily laden. He knew his guest of old. "Stygian ports are temporarily open to our ships, as ours to theirs. But may no craft of mine meet their cursed galleys out of sight of land. That galley crept into the bay last night. What its masters wish I do not know. So far they have neither bought nor sold. I distrust those dark-skinned devils. Treachery had its birth in that dusky land." "I've made them howl," Conan said carelessly, turning from the window. "In my galley, manned by black corsairs, I crept to the very bastions of the sea-washed castles of black-walled Kemi by night, and burned the galleons anchored there. And, speaking of treachery, mine host, suppose you taste these viands and sip a bit of this wine, just to show me that your heart is on the right side." Publio complied so readily that Conan's suspicions were lulled, and without further hesitation he sat down and devoured enough for 3 men. And while he ate, men moved through the markets and along the waterfront, searching for a Zingaran who had a jewel to sell or who sought for a ship to carry him to foreign ports. And a tall, gaunt man with a scar on his temple sat with his elbows on a wine-stained table in a squalid cellar with a brass lantern hanging from a smoke-blackened beam overhead, and held converse with the desperate rogues whose sinister countenances and ragged garments proclaimed their profession. And as the first stars blinked out, they shone on a strange band spurring their mounts along the white road that led to Messantia from the west. They were 4 men, tall, gaunt, clad in black, hooded robes, and they did not speak.
They forced their steeds mercilessly onward, and those steeds were gaunt as themselves, and sweat-stained and weary, as if from long travel and far wandering. Chapter 14. The Black Hand of Seth. Conan woke from a sound sleep as quickly and instantly as a cat, and like a cat he was on his feet with his sword out before the man who had touched him could so much as draw back.
"What word, Publio?"
demanded Conan, recognizing his host. The gold lamp burned low, casting a mellow glow over the thick tapestries and the rich coverings of the couch whereon he had been reposing. Publio, recovering from the start given him by the sudden action of his awakening guest, replied, "The Zigaran has been located. He arrived yesterday at dawn. Only a few hours ago he sought to sell a huge, strange jewel to a Shemitish merchant, but the Shemite would have naught to do with him. Men say he turned pale beneath his black beard at the sight of it, and closing his stall fled as from a thing accursed."
"It must be Belozo,"
muttered Conan, feeling the pulse in his temples pounding with impatient eagerness.
"Where is he now?"
"He sleeps in the house of Servio."
"I know that dive of old," grunted Conan. "I'd better hasten before some of those waterfront thieves cut his throat for the jewel."
He took up his cloak and flung it over his shoulders, then donned a helmet Publio had procured for him.
"Have my steed saddled and ready in the court,"
said he.
"I may return in haste. I shall not forget this night's work, Publio."
A few moments later, Publio, standing at the small outer door, watched the king's tall figure receding down the shadowy street. "Farewell to you, Corsair," muttered the merchant. "This must be a notable jewel to be sought by a man who has just lost a kingdom. I wish I had told my knaves to let him secure it before they did their work. But then something might have gone awry. Let Argos forget Amra, and let my dealings with him be lost in the dust of the past. In the alley behind the house of Servio, that is where Conan will cease to be a peril to me." Servios' house, a dingy, ill-famed den, was located close to the wharves, facing the waterfront. It was a shambling building of stone and heavy ship beams, and a long, narrow alley wandered up alongside it. Conan made his way along the alley, and as he reached the house, he had an uneasy feeling that he was being spied upon. He stared hard into the shadows of the squalid buildings, but saw nothing, though once he caught a faint rasp of cloth or leather against flesh. But that was nothing unusual. Thieves and beggars prowled these alleys at night, and they were not likely to attack him after one look at his size and harness. But suddenly a door opened in the wall ahead of him, and he slipped into the shadow of an arch. A figure emerged from the open door and moved along the alley, not furtively, but with a natural noiselessness, like that of a jungle beast. Enough starlight filtered into the alley to silhouette the man's profile dimly as he passed the doorway where Conan lurked. The stranger was a Stygian. There was no mistaking that hawk-faced, shaven head, even in the starlight, nor the mantle over the broad shoulders. He passed on down the alley in the direction of the beach, and once again Conan thought he must be carrying a lantern among his garments, for he caught a flash of lambent light just as the man vanished. But the Cimmerian forgot the stranger as he noticed that the door through which he had emerged still stood open. Conan had intended entering by the main entrance and forcing Servio to show him the room where the Zingaran slept, but If he could get into the house without attracting anyone's attention, so much the better. A few long strides brought him to the door, and as his hands fell on the lock, he stifled an involuntary grunt. His practiced fingers, skilled among the thieves of Zamora long ago, told him that the lock had been forced, apparently by some terrific pressure from the outside that had twisted and bent the heavy iron bolts, tearing the very sockets loose from the jambs. How such damage could have been wrought so violently without awakening everyone in the neighborhood, Conan could not imagine, but he felt sure that it had been done this night. A broken lock, if discovered, would not go unmended in the house of Servio, in this neighborhood of thieves and cutthroats. Conan entered stealthily, poniard in hand, wondering how he was to find the chamber of the Zingaran. Groping in total darkness, he halted suddenly. He sensed death in that room, as a wild beast senses it, not as peril threatening him, but a dead thing, something freshly slain. In the darkness, his foot hit and recoiled from something heavy and yielding. With a sudden premonition, he groped along the wall until he found a shelf that supported a brass lamp, with its flint, steel and tinder beside it. A few seconds later, a flickering, uncertain light sprang up, and he stared narrowly about him. A bunk built against the rough stone wall, a bare table and a bench completed the furnishings of the squalid chamber. An inner door stood closed and bolted, and on the hard-beaten dirt floor lay Beloso. On his back he lay, with his head drawn back between his shoulders, so that he seemed to stare with his wide glassy eyes at the sooty beams of the cobwebbed ceiling. His lips were drawn back from his teeth in a frozen grin of agony. His sword lay near him, still in its scabbard. His shirt was torn open, and on his brown muscular breast was the print of a black hand, thumb and forefingers plainly distinct. Conan glared in silence, feeling the short hairs bristle at the back of his neck. "Crum," he muttered, "the black hand of Seth." He had seen that mark of old, the death mark of the black priests of Seth, the grim cult that ruled in dark Stygia, and suddenly he remembered that curious flash he had seen emanating from the mysterious Stygian who had emerged from this chamber. "The heart, by Crom," he muttered. "He was carrying it under his mantle. He stole it. He burst that door by his magic and slew Beloso. He was a priest of Seth." A quick investigation confirmed at least part of his suspicions. The jewel was not on the Zingaran's body. An uneasy feeling rose in Conan that this had not happened by chance or without design. A conviction that the mysterious Stygian galley had come into the harbor of Messantia on a definite mission. How could a priest of Seth know that the heart had come southward? Yet the thought was no more fantastic than the necromancy that could slay an armed man by the touch of an open, empty hand. A stealthy footfall outside the door brought him round like a great cat. With one motion he extinguished the lamp and drew his sword. His ears told him that men were out there in the darkness, were closing in on the doorway. As his eyes became accustomed to the sudden darkness, he could make out dim figures ringing the entrance. He could not guess their identity, but as always he took the initiative, leaping suddenly forth from the doorway without awaiting the attack. His unexpected movement took the skulkers by surprise. He sensed and heard men close about him, saw a dim masked figure in the starlight before him. Then his sword crunched home, and he was fleeting away down the alley before the slower thinking and slower acting attackers could intercept him. As he ran, he heard, somewhere ahead of him, a faint creak of oar locks, and he forgot the men behind him. A boat was moving out into the bay. Gritting his teeth, he increased his speed, but before he reached the beach, he heard the rasp and creak of ropes and the grind of the great sweep in its socket. Thick clouds rolling up from the sea obscured the stars. In thick darkness, Conan came upon the strand, straining his eyes out across the black, restless water. Something was moving out there, a long, low black shape that receded in the darkness, gathering momentum as it went. To his ears came the rhythmical clack of long oars. He ground his teeth in helpless fury. It was the Stygian galley, and she was racing out to sea, bearing with her the jewel that meant to him the throne of Aquilonia. With a savage curse, he took a step toward the waves that leapt against the sands, catching at his hauberk and intending to rip it off and swim after the vanishing ship. Then the crunch of a heel in the sand brought him about. He had forgotten his pursuers. Dark figures closed in on him with a rush of feet through the sands. The first went down beneath the Cimmerian's flailing sword, but the others did not falter. Blades whickered dimly about him in the darkness or rasped on his mail. Blood and entrails spilled over his hand, and someone screamed as he ripped murderously upward. A muttered voice spurred on the attack, and that voice sounded vaguely familiar. Conan plowed through the clinging, hacking shapes toward the voice. A faint light gleaming momentarily through the drifting clouds showed him a tall, gaunt man with a great livid scar on his temple. Conan's sword sheared through his skull as through a ripe melon. Then an axe, swung blindly in the dark, crashed on the king's bassinet, filling his eyes with sparks of fire. He lurched and lunged, felt his sword sink deep, and heard a shriek of agony. Then he stumbled over a corpse, and a bludgeon knocked the dented helmet from his head. The next instant, the club fell full on his unprotected skull. The king of Aquilonia crumpled into the wet sands. Over him, wolfish figures panted in the gloom.
"Strike off his head,"
muttered one.
"Let him be," grunted another. "Help me tie up my wounds before I bleed to death. The tide will wash him into the bay. See, he fell at the water's edge. His skull split. No man could live after such blows."
"Help me strip him," urged another. "His harness will fetch a few pieces of silver. And haste! Tiberio is dead, and I hear seamen singing as they reel along the strand. Let us be gone."
There followed hurried activity in the darkness, and then the sound of quickly receding footsteps. The tipsy singing of the seamen grew louder. In his chamber, Publio, nervously pacing back and forth before a window that overlooked the shadowed bay, whirled suddenly, his nerves tingling. To the best of his knowledge, the door had been bolted from within, but now it stood open and 4 men filed into the chamber. At the sight of them, his flesh crawled. Many strange beings Publio had seen in his lifetime, but none before like these. They were tall and gaunt, black-robed, and their faces were dim yellow ovals in the shadows of their coifs. He could not tell much about their features, and was unreasoningly glad that he could not. Each bore a long, curiously mottled staff.
Who are you?
he demanded, and his voice sounded brittle and hollow.
What do you wish here?
Where is Conan, he who was king of Aquilonia? Demanded the tallest of the four in a passionless monotone that made Publio shudder. It was like the hollow tone of a kitten temple bell.
I do not know what you mean,
stammered the merchant, his customary poise shaken by the uncanny aspect of his visitors.
I know no such man.
He has been here, returned the other with no change of inflection. His horse is in the courtyard. Tell us where he is before we do you an injury.
Gebal!
shouted Publio frantically, recoiling until he crouched against the wall.
Gebal!
The four kittens watched him without emotion or change of expression. If you summon your slave, he will die, warned one of them, which only served to terrify Publio more than ever.
Gebal!
he screamed.
Where are you? Curse you! Thieves are murdering your master!
Swift footsteps in the corridor outside, and Gebal burst into the chamber, a Shemite of medium height and mightily muscled build, his curled blue-black beard bristling, and a short leaf-shaped sword in his hand. He stared in stupid amazement at the four invaders, unable to understand their presence, dimly remembering that he had drowsed unexplainably on the stair he was guarding and up which they must have come. He had never slept on duty before, but his master was shrieking with a note of hysteria in his voice, and the Shemite drove like a bull at the strangers, his thickly muscled arm drawing back from the disemboweling thrust. But the stroke was never dealt. A black-sleeved arm shot out, extending the long staff. Its end but touched the Shemite's brawny breast and was instantly withdrawn. The stroke was horribly like the dart and recovery of the serpent's head. Gebal halted short in his headlong plunge, as if he had encountered a solid barrier. His bull head toppled forward on his breast. The sword slipped from his fingers, and then he melted slowly to the floor. It was as if all the bones of his frame had suddenly become flabby. Publio turned sick. "Do not shout again," advised the tallest kitten. "Your servants sleep soundly, but if you waken them they will die, and you with them. Where is Conan?"
He is gone to the house of Servio, near the waterfront, to search for the Zingaran Beloso,"
gasped Publio, all his power of resistance gone out of him. The merchant did not lack courage, but these uncanny visitants turned his marrow to water. He started convulsively at a sudden noise of footsteps hurrying up the stair outside, loud in the ominous stillness. "Your servant?" asked the kitten. Publio shook his head mutely, his tongue frozen to his palate. He could not speak. One of the kittens caught up a silken cover from a couch and threw it over the corpse. Then they melted behind the tapestry, but before the tallest man disappeared, he murmured, "Talk to this man who comes and send him away quickly. If you betray us, neither he nor you will live to reach that door. Make no sign to show him that you are not alone." And lifting his staff suggestively, the yellow man faded behind the hangings. Publio shuddered and choked down a desire to retch. It might have been a trick of the light, but it seemed to him that occasionally those staffs moved slightly of their own accord, as if possessed of an unspeakable life of their own. He pulled himself together with a mighty effort and presented a composed aspect to the ragged ruffian who burst into the chamber.
"We have done as you wished, my lord,"
This man exclaimed.
"The barbarian lies dead on the sands at the water's edge."
Publio felt a movement in the arras behind him and almost burst from fright. The man swept headlessly on.
"Your secretary Tiberio is dead. The barbarian slew him and 4 of my companions. We bore their bodies to the rendezvous. There was nothing of value on the barbarian except a few silver coins. Are there any further orders?"
"None!" gasped Publio, white about his lips. "Go!" The desperado bowed and hurried out with a vague feeling that Publio was both a man of weak stomach and few words. The 4 kittens came from behind the arras. "Of whom did this man speak?" the taller demanded.
"Of a wandering stranger who did me an injury,"
panted Publio. "You lie," said the kitten calmly. "He spoke of the king of Aquilonia. I read it in your expression. Sit upon that divan and do not move or speak. I will remain with you while my 3 companions go search for the body." So Publio sat and shook with terror of the silent, inscrutable figure which watched him, until the 3 kittens filed back into the room with the news that Conan's body did not lie upon the sands. Publio did not know whether to be glad or sorry.
"We found a spot where the fight was fought," they said. "Blood was on the sand, but the king was gone."
The 4th kitten drew imaginary symbols upon the carpet with his staff, which glistened scalily in the lamplight. "Did you read naught from the sands?" he asked.
"Aye," they answered. "The king lives, and he has gone southward in a ship."
The tall kitten lifted his head and gazed at Publio, so that the merchant broke into a profuse sweat.
"What do you wish of me?"
he stuttered. "A ship," answered the kitten. "A ship well manned for a very long voyage."
For how long a voyage?"
stammered Publio, never thinking of refusing. "To the ends of the world, perhaps," answered the kitten, "or to the molten seas of hell that lie beyond the sunrise."